You know, we all need signs. I'm sure you used some of them on your way here to get here safely. At least I hope you did. But there are times when, you sometimes feel like the need to break a sign and break a rule in the process of not obeying the sign. And that's what happened to me this morning when I got into my car and was on my way to church and realized I was about to run out of gas. Did it ever happen to you? It happens to me at least once a month, I think. It feels like that anyways. And so when I found myself at a light and I couldn't do two things. One, I couldn't go because it was red. And two, I couldn't turn left because it was prohibited. So I broke both of those rules because the fear of turning later and not turning in that moment into the gas station, I feared I'd have to push this car and be late for this thing that we're doing right now. And I just couldn't risk that. And so sometimes I think, did I just sin twice before coming to church? You ever, right? Honestly, I think I actually did, right? I broke two road rules, but it was almost like the rules were keeping me from getting to my destination safely. And so sometimes I think there's a moment in which you have to make a decision. Is this going to be where I just trust God and I keep following the rules, or I break the rules and get to my destination because there's an urgency that I feel that I'm not going to make it if I do it any other way. And I'm sharing this because I want you to understand the story that we're about to look at. The story we're about to look at is about a king who was put in a very similar predicament. He found himself struggling with the same type of decision. And I know that every traveler and every journey needs signs. And when you're leading God's nation, God is doing everything that He can to put the right signs in front of you so that you lead God's people correctly. And Ahaz was a king, and he was the king of Judah. And at this time, the kingdom was still divided in two. And there was a different king who led the northern part of the country called Israel, and the southern part was being led by Ahaz, who was just 20 years old. And on top of it, he had been shown a pattern of idolatry, one which he was continuing. And when he was put in a position to go against the Assyrians in battle by joining the northern kingdom called Israel, then they would have gone together against Assyria. But Ahaz decides that this is just too dangerous. This is just too risky. It isn't worth it. And so Isaiah comes to Ahaz and pleads with him and says, I want you to reconsider your course, the direction that you're heading. You're not doing the right thing. And because you're not doing the right thing, I'm here to plead with you so that you do it. And Ahaz is unconvinced. And many times in our own life, even though God is sending us signs, we are ignoring them. Even though He's trying to prevent us from going off course, even though He's telling us that this is a life and death situation, we just prefer to do things our way. Now, when you take a flight and you're on a plane, you listen to the safety instructions, and you do it because, well, you have no other choice. It's like mandatory that it's done. So everything stops. Like if you've got in-flight entertainment, the entertainment stops because you need to pay attention to this, even if we choose to then still ignore it. Isn't it true? We figure we've heard this, we know this. How different could it be? And it isn't the point, is it? The safety instructions are there to make sure that we always get to our destination, even if we make a decision to ignore it and to say, I know this, or I know what to do in case of an emergency. I get it. I am going to shout and scream to my death. I understand. There is no way of getting out of this, probably. And so, in some cases, we recognize that we're just simply looking for a sign. But what happens if God comes directly into your life like he did with Ahaz? Isaiah is sent by God directly to him and tells him, listen, you don't have to choose this path. In fact, God is putting this in front of you. He's saying, I want you to understand that it's really important that we pay attention to God right now, because God is saying he is willing to give you signs. And that's really important for me to hear, because it's important to understand that signs initiated by God are the most important signs we can receive. They supersede all other understandings and applications of rules, of what must be done in a certain situation. God is saying, I want my signs to be followed. And so in Isaiah, in chapter 7 and verse 10 and 11, Isaiah says this to him. The Lord sent this message to King Ahaz. Ask the Lord your God for a sign of confirmation, Ahaz. And then he says, I want you to make it as difficult as you want, as high as heaven, or as deep as the place of the dead. Like, this is how much God was pleading with Ahaz. He's saying, I'm telling you, you can ask me for anything and in any way that you want it. It wasn't something that was being prohibited. It was something that was being entirely encouraged by God. And yet, we see that when Isaiah does this, it communicates to us that God initiates signs. The conversation of signs, the importance of signs, the necessity for the clarity of signs, the fact that you and I need signs, that sometimes we are so afraid, we are so fearful, we are struggling in our faith, that God says, I am willing to give you whatever sign you would need to take the step that I know is going to bring life and bring safety to all those that you lead. God is saying, will you not trust me with this? And I've been in times and in places in my life where I've been fearful, struggling, where my faith was weak. And I needed to turn to God and say, God, what is the answer? What is the direction? What is it that I need? And I kept waiting for God to speak, but I didn't understand this most important concept. And that is that we could be specific with the sign that we needed. You see, he tells him very clearly, put that verse back up. It says right there, make it as difficult as you want. It means that you get to choose the conditions under which the sign is revealed. Make it as high as heaven or as deep as the place of the dead. It doesn't matter. Whatever you need, I will give it to you and I will make it clear to you. That's how much God loves us. And that's how much he wants us to have his guidance in our lives. Maybe you didn't know you could ask God for these things. And you can ask God for this kind of clarity. But in Ahaz's case, you would think this would be enough, except that now he refuses God's gift of signs. Even though God sent him such a clear message for this young and frightened king, he told Ahaz not to fear the two kings because Israel was even plotting to replace him with another king. Aram, he was going to take his spot. And he knew that this was happening. And so he's like, I don't know if I can trust the northern kingdom. And I don't know if I can trust this other king to stay away. And so I'm just going to go ahead and do this my own way. But then it says this in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 9. That unless your faith is firm, Isaiah tells him, I cannot make you stand firm. Unless your faith is firm, I can't make you stand firm. And I look at that and I say, God, thank you for making that clear. Because there is a part that we have to play. See, God says, I'll give you any sign that you need, but there's one thing that I can't do for you, and that's make you stand firm. I'll give you whatever it is that is required, whatever it is that you need, but I cannot do this. I cannot be the one who makes you stand and makes you believe and makes you go in the direction that I'm asking you to go in. You have to do this yourself. So unless our faith is firm, God says, I can't make you stand firm. And so that's why sometimes we ask God for signs, but then we go about doing things our own way. Ask a sign, he says, of the Lord your God, and let it be as high as heaven or as deep as the place of the dead. And what does Ahaz do? Well, the scriptures tell us that in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 12, it says this, but the king refused. No, he said, I will not test the Lord like that. Isn't he testing him anyways? What is he doing here? He's hiding behind his own preference. He's hiding behind his own decision, his own choice. And let me tell you something. Sometimes we know what is right. We know what is good. We know what is perfect. We know what is already the best for us, but we choose to go our way anyways. That's what Ahaz is doing. Saying, yeah, I get it. Isaiah, thanks for coming, Thanks for telling me what you think God wanted me to hear and needed me to hear. I'm so grateful for you to say what you said, but you know what? No, I'm not going to test the Lord like that. So there is something in this. Now, why does Ahaz say this? He says this because it's also true. You see, you can't just be asking God for signs and testing him on things we already know are true. On things that he's already said in his word. On things that he's already written about and told us about. On things that we already know are right. On things that we already know are wrong. On things that we already know are sinful. And things that we already know are holy. And so when we test God in this, then yes, we sin. And so Isaiah is not fooled by anything that Ahaz is saying, and neither is God. And so he is still in a position here where he's trying to enact something that we see Jesus himself speak about. In fact, it brings our recollection and our memory to a passage found in Matthew chapter 16, verse 1. There it says that on the day that the Pharisees and Sadducees came to test Jesus, they demanded he show them a miraculous sign from heaven to prove his authority. Now, the people who were asking for this were the religious leaders And the reason they were asking wasn't because they were in need, not because they wanted to believe, but rather they wanted to prove that he couldn't do it at their request. See, this was a moment in which they were just trying to trick God. And there's been moments I've heard people go before God and say things like this: if you're real, then just do this. They don't actually want God to do any of it, but they want to prove the point that God won't. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees did exactly this. They didn't go in wanting to believe. They went in trying to prove that they were always right not to. And I wonder, are we sometimes asking God to provide a sign when we really don't want him to? If we do, then we're like the Pharisees. We're like the Sadducees. God, if you show me, I'll stop. I'll stop right now, God. Just make yourself known, make yourself real. We already know we need to stop, but we're just telling God to help us through a sign to show us what we already know we need to do, but we don't want to stop. We don't want things to be different. We don't want things to be anything other than what we want them to be. And so we ask God for things that we actually don't want him to do. And when that happens, we don't get the sign because we already know the answer. It reveals what's already in our hearts. And what God is trying to show us is that, are you going to be like Ahaz and try to produce the answer yourself? We find out that Isaiah comes and he does all this because in 2 Kings chapter 16 verse 7, look at what it says. Ahaz sent messengers to king of Assyria with this message: I am your servant and your vassal. Come up and rescue me from the attacking armies of Aram and Israel. He had already submitted to the king of Assyria. And so when Isaiah comes, he already knows he's done this. But he's trying to tell him, you don't have to continue on this path. You know, sometimes in our hearts and in our lives and our life decisions, we've already committed to the course. We've already committed to the path. We've already committed to the decision. We're already committed to the journey that we're on. And we don't want to stop. We don't want to start over with something else, with someone else, with another place, with another person. We don't want to do that. And God is telling us exactly that. I want you to be a different person, and I want you to start over from a different place. And I want your decision to be one where I am the one who directs your steps. I don't want you to choose this path on your own anymore. And we get tired of waiting. I think that's the hardest challenge, isn't it? You know, the more time passes, the more difficult it becomes to wait. And you know what's happening in Ahaz's life is that the armies that are about to come upon him are just 3 days away. It's like imminent that they're about to attack. And so he does the only thing that he knows how to do, is that he takes things and matters into his own hands. Have you ever done that? Have you ever decided to take a course of action, to go in a direction, to ignore the signs that God was clearly giving you, just so that you could produce the result that you wanted instead? I mean, that's the story of my life. I'm going to be honest. That's what I do more often than I care to admit. I try to make things happen instead of waiting for God to make them happen. I create my own signs and give my own interpretations to those signs instead of waiting for God to give me his signs and the interpretation of the sign. When God is trying to show us the difference. You see, when we go to spiritual leaders, when we go to the spiritual source, when we go to the spiritual scriptures, when we go to God himself, he guides and directs us because we cannot fully trust our own intuitions. I believe in your intuition. I believe that more often than not, your intuition, your first crack at it is right. But I'm also aware that you ignore that more often than you should. Anybody else recognize that? Like you have a good way of assessing the situation, but then not trusting how you've assessed it. I believe that God is constantly guiding us and providing the signs, but then we just swat them away like a nuisance, like a fly that's buzzing around us, or a wasp, and it feels dangerous, like it's about to sting us, and we don't want to be anywhere near that. And so we just continue on the path that we want to be on instead of paying attention to what's been going on inside us and outside of us all along. What we notice in this story is that there are two things that are happening. One is that there are two signs from God. One is external and the other is internal. And there are external signs in Ahaz's life, and he's not paying attention to them. The king of Israel comes to him and says, "Join me in the fight against Assyria." And he knows this is the right thing to do, but he ignores it. External, God sends a prophet, Isaiah, whose accuracy has been 100%, and whose connection to God is uncontested. And he comes to him and tells him exactly what he needs to do, and he ignores it. External, in that everything is showing him that no matter what path he takes, submitting to Assyria or choosing to do this alone, that this is not the right way to go. But he chooses to do it anyways because he would rather trust in kings and alliances and allegiances, and the scriptures show us in 2 Kings, in idolatry. See, Ahaz didn't just believe in God, he believed in other gods. Let me tell you something, when you believe in other gods, when you have other sources of spirituality and superstition guiding you, here's what's going to happen. You're going to respond like Ahaz did. Because you're going to look at God as being just another option out there, instead of the only way to go. And what God is trying to help us understand is that there are no other options out there. There's only one, and it's listening to God. There is no other option other than paying attention to the signs that he provides. And it sounds so easy to do that, but there are times when our idolatry can be a certain ministry, a speaker, a teaching, a guide, a guidance. It could be scriptures, sacred, found in other sacred texts. It can be things that sound true and are true to some level, have a measure of truth, but are still not God. They have the light of God, but they're still just shadows to God. And so everything in this world and in this life is going to reflect the light of God. But not everything is God. And what God is trying to show us is that there's then internal signs. And when these internal signs occur within us, these signs, they spring from the living God. They resonate in our spirits in a supernatural way. And they can occur in a dream, in a vision, in a knowing. Like no matter what the opposition, we just know. It's a feeling. It is an understanding that fills us, that we know we didn't possess before this moment. And in Isaiah chapter 7, and in verse 14, it says something beautiful in this passage. In the moment in which Ahaz is making decisions about what he should do about Assyria and Israel and Aram and these kings that are coming to attack him, Isaiah gives a prophecy about the Messiah. And you're like, how does that even fit in this? He isn't just giving Ahaz a sign for his life, but he's giving him a sign for future generations. Isn't that amazing? And what you don't understand is that your life represents a legacy. What you understand from God can impact generations to come. 700 years before the birth of Jesus is even possible, Isaiah is already saying there's going to be a virgin who's going to give birth to him. Before Ahaz can even believe that God can rescue him today and make sure that nothing happens to him even in 3 days' time when the armies approach, he's saying, I'm going to make sure that your kingdom endures forever. That when the Messiah is born, the house of David, the tribe of Judah, will forever sit on the throne. Can we say amen to that? Isn't that amazing? That God speaks not just to our present, but he speaks to our future. See, the signs you get today are not just for today, they're for the future. God is revealing that the decisions that he wants us to make and the ones that are essential for us to obey are signs that he's giving us because it's going to have a lasting impact. All right then, the Lord himself will give you the sign. Look, the virgin will conceive a child and she will give birth to a son and we'll call him Emmanuel. It means God is with us. And what this tells us is that this wasn't just a moment for Ahaz. It was a moment that was being foretold so that we would always know that God is with us. God is with you right now. God is with you to lead you, to guide you. That Jesus is the ultimate sign and gift. And in the same way that some prophecies have a near fulfillment, there's also prophecies like this one to a greater future fulfillment. And this is a direct prophecy that was fulfilled in Isaiah's day. But it's also a fulfillment for a future event that hasn't even happened yet. I don't know if you've ever thought of signs this way, but the signs that God gives, they're gifts. They're gifts for you today, but they're also gifts for you and your tomorrow. It's hard to believe in tomorrow when we've gone through such trauma and tragedy, when we're going through difficult things, when we're grieving and suffering, when there is pain, when there is still that which has yet to be resolved. It is hard for us to believe that God could give me a sign for today when I'm going through so much. But what God is promising is that I'm not just going to give you a sign for today, I'm going to give you a sign for tomorrow and every other tomorrow after this. Some prophecies that God gives are there for us to understand this beautiful truth. Look at what it says in John chapter 10, verse 27 and 28. It says that my sheep listen to my voice. And I know that you're here today because you want to listen to the voice of the great shepherd. You want to listen to God speaking to you and revealing his signs to you. I know them, he says, and they follow me. Jesus is saying, this is the kind of relationship I want to have with you. And so I give them eternal life, and they will never perish. And then he promises this, no one can snatch them away from me. Ahaz couldn't believe that one day this could happen to him, so he felt he needed to take things into his own hands. Let me tell you something. The moment that you feel you have to take matters into your own hands is the moment that you know that you are about to fail. Because you are being led by fear and not faith. The moment you feel, if I don't do something, this is all going to fall apart, you know it's already fallen apart. The moment that you think that you're going to do this through your own strategies, through your own systems, and through your own schemes, you know that you're just walking in step with what Satan's strategy is for your life. The moment you feel that if you don't make this move, there's no move to make, you know that you are not waiting on God for His clarity, His signs, His direction in your life. You know that you are actually not listening to His voice as the shepherd. You're just doing what's in your own heart. You're ignoring the external signs, you're ignoring the internal signs, and you're allowing yourself to be led by your fear because you think this is a life and death situation, and so you've got to do something. Well, that's what Ahaz thought. Instead of listening to God, he listened to himself. And guess what? He died anyways. He failed anyways. His kingdom was taken from him anyways. The blessing was never for him. And God's saying, I don't want that to be you. This is what I want for you. I want to give you the kind of life that never ends and that no one can ever snatch you from me. Jesus is saying, I want to make this promise to you. It's a promise not just of Jesus' voice, but it's a promise of how He promises to always guide us. Can I ask you something? Are you struggling to hear His voice? I bet you the answer is yes. But then I ask people, how much time do you spend with Jesus? How familiar are you with His voice? And by His voice, I mean with His word. When I have conversations with people, people say, like, where does this wisdom come from? I'm like, yeah, I'm a really wise guy. No, I say it comes from the Scriptures. It comes from the Scriptures. My wisdom comes from God's word. I have some natural wisdom, but honestly, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about God's wisdom. There's nothing better than God's wisdom. Would you agree? For your life, wouldn't you agree God's wisdom is the best? So you know how I know God's voice is by studying the Scriptures, by knowing what He says on the matter. And then when I have to make life decisions, I notice the difference between me choosing to do something and then God telling me already, this is not what I want for you. Me making justifications for something that I already want to do. That's what Ahaz did. And so Jesus is saying, listen, I have a voice, and you can know it, and you can also follow it. And you can follow me when you do. Build up that relationship with Jesus. And then we have His promise of protection. How many of you want to be protected in your life decisions? Protected by the signs that you're following, by the things that God is doing in your life. See, God is ready to give you that and offer you that. But isn't it time we just do things maybe differently? Like honestly, just start to do things differently going forward from right now. And saying, God, I don't want to just do things the way I've always done them. I want to do them your way instead. I don't want to just pay attention to the things that I want. I want to pay attention to the things that you're saying, to the things that you said. I don't want to just follow my own heart. I want to know your heart. And I want your heart to become the heart that beats within my chest. So that every day, instead of following the voice of this world and our culture, and the voice of my wants and my desires, the voice of my lust and my flesh, and the voice of those things that are promised to me from Satan himself, I want to listen to your voice instead. I want your voice to be the voice that guides me. I want your voice to be the voice that leads me. your voice that protects me, and your voice that leads me through the journey of this life and brings me to my destination. I want that voice to be the voice of Jesus and none other. Ahaz could have listened to Isaiah's voice, but he chose to listen to his own. And that's a warning for us. It's a story that reminds us that this too can happen to us. And when it does, it can remove God's protection from our life, just like it was removed from Ahaz. And God doesn't want that for us. God wants to protect you. He wants to give his promises to you. He wants to prosper you and bless you like never before, because his promises are not just for today. They're for building your legacy. You have a legacy to build. A life that is going to keep speaking beyond the moments that we have. That's what God is promising you. A life of legacy.